Hey guys, this video is for the juniors. We're going to continue talking about the New Deal in this video. In all the ways it tried to deal with some of the worst effects of the Great Depression. Relief, recovery, and reform. Remember, those were the three R's that guided the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. Um, we left off talking about the NRA and the all those codes of production and everything, and then the AAA, which paid farmers not to farm, gave them subsidies to do that. The Federal Securities Act, which established the SEC to regulate stock transactions. Now, one of the things about the New Deal that I don't think gets as much attention as it should. Maybe it used to, but like not so much anymore in like studies of the New Deal, is what it did for the rural South. Now, the thing is that the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt really tried to steer a lot of federal dollars to try to help conditions in the South. Now, things in the South have been bad for a very long time. The Depression made them worse, but economically, things in the South have been pretty awful for decades. And I know sounds kind of rough, but the South was, after Reconstruction was over, the South was basically left to rot. A lot of Northerners were just like, or the federal government was just like, whatever. They're so backwards down there. They're so racist. They'll never develop. They're primitive. Everybody's poor. Let's let them do whatever. That was kind of the attitude that most Americans had toward the South for decades after Reconstruction was over. But FDR made a concerted effort to try to help the South. And that was one of the reasons why Franklin Roosevelt, even though he was so liberal, was actually beloved in the conservative South. He was also a Democrat. Remember, the South was solidly Democratic at this time. But it was much deeper than that because FDR made a concerted effort to try to help the South. Like during World War II, the reason why a lot of army bases are to this day located in the South is because Roosevelt actually steered federal dollars, military dollars to the South in order to build bases, in order to create jobs and stimulate the economy down there. So FDR made a concerted effort to try to help the South, which had been so neglected. Now, probably his most famous alphabet agency they created to do that was the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, the thing is that a lot of areas in the South, particularly in the more rural areas, still did not have electricity, even into the 1930s. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, actually created in 1933 in Alabama, even though it's called Tennessee Valley because the Tennessee is named after the river, not the state. In Alabama, the government created a huge hydroelectric plant to provide cheap electricity to the people down south. And not only that, but it also provided an enormous amount of construction jobs in order to build the plant. Cheap electricity to the region. They probably couldn't afford it if a private company had actually been providing the electricity because there's a profit motive. It also reduced flooding and soil erosion because it was a hydroelectric plant. So the Tennessee Valley Authority is an enormous achievement. And just to give you some idea, the TVA is still around to this day, providing electricity to millions of people in the South. So the fact that 80 plus years later we still have the TVA is quite a monument to its success. And also just the beginning of FDR's attempts to really try to help the South. Some other achievements of Roosevelt that were not specifically New Deal related. Prohibition finally ended under Franklin Roosevelt. FDR was adamantly opposed to prohibition. And, his song, Happy Days Are Here Again, his campaign song in 1932, it was actually about prohibition and the end of prohibition, saying happy days are here again because prohibition is going to end. And FDR actually signed a bill legalizing and taxing wine and beer once the 21st Amendment was passed, which repealed the 18th Amendment. The prohibition is the only constitutional amendment that's ever been repealed. So by the end of 1933, alcohol was legal again in the United States. So we were finished with that experiment. Also in 1933, the FDR took the United States off the gold standard. Now, a lot of conservatives didn't like that, but Roosevelt always believed that tying the currency to gold limited the money supply. So if you actually took the money off the gold standard and let the dollar float, then that actually would inflate the currency and stimulate the economy, there'd be more money out there in the system. Um, some real right wing people still bemoan the fact that Roosevelt did that in 1933. But it was totally necessary. And gold also is very arbitrary when you think about it. Like, why back up the money with gold as opposed to anything, right? And it deflates the economy, and that's the last thing we needed in during the Depression. Now, the New Deal was not perfect. There were serious problems with the New Deal. Remember, we talked about this. The New Deal was kind of created by the seat of his pants, FDR. Just, all right, we got a problem. Let's just figure out something to do it. And they figured out something, and in a week, they got Congress to pass the bill. So a lot of these programs were not very well thought out because it was an emergency, and he was just kind of trying to figure out anything to do to try to help people. So there were inevitable problems, particularly with the implementation. The NRA, the Blue Eagle, to try to get all those companies and businesses to join. Businesses began resisting the NRA codes and regulation as time went on. They felt that it was just too obsessed with like bureaucratic minutia, with little rules and regulations here and there, and that began. If there's one thing business hates, it's bureaucracy. And the NRA was becoming increasingly bureaucratic as time went on. And in 1935, which we discussed in our live class today, the Supreme Court found the NRA unconstitutional, that it gave too much power to the federal government and to the president specifically. That was their grounds, even though the Supreme Court was very conservative and they were consistently striking down New Deal legislation in the 1930s. Now, the NRA was struck down. Its record was mixed, but it did initiate important reforms. End of child labor, which progressives have been trying to do for decades, a minimum wage, the right to join a union. All those things were part of the NRA codes. If a business joined the NRA, they had to abide by those codes. So that was just our first taste of those kind of reforms eventually being implemented nationwide to all businesses. Now, the AAA was also deeply controversial, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The idea of paying farmers not to farm and then to have them destroy crops, that, just seemed, almost obscene at a time of hunger. But it was successful, the AAA, in actually dealing with the overproduction crisis. Farm income went up 50%. As a result of the AAA. Well, one of the worst unintended consequences of the AAA was that it did not include tenant farmers, sharecroppers, or migrant workers. In fact, the AAA made things worse. Now, let me explain. The thing is that, remember, it's paying farmers not to farm. So the thing is that it's to grow less. So a lot of farmers just stopped renting their land to tenant farmers or sharecroppers. Because, obviously, they're producing stuff, tenant farmers and sharecroppers. So the thing is that, if you want to deal with overproduction, you just get rid of the other farmers who are on your land. This had deep racial implications because African Americans tended to be sharecroppers down south. And a lot of poor whites who were tenant farmers, and also a lot of whites who were sharecroppers too. So the AAA wound up, in order to deal with overproduction, wound up displacing a lot of sharecroppers. So it was a real unintended consequence, negative unintended consequence of the AAA, which was also found unconstitutional in 1936 by the Supreme Court. Making things worse for the farming sector was the fact that the Dust Bowl was going on. There was serious drought in the middle part of the country that made a lot of areas kind of unlivable. In certain areas in 1930, that's before FDR came in, but 1930, there was no rain at all, like the entire year in certain areas of the middle part of the country, in Kansas and Oklahoma. The mid-1930s, the droughts continued. Not just because of no rain, but also after years of overproduction, the land was kind of just exhausted and just couldn't grow any more stuff. There was some joke that the clouds of dust used to go as far east as Washington, D.C. That's how dusty it was. And some congressman joked when he saw a big dust cloud, "Oh, there goes Oklahoma." Very nice. But the Dust Bowl was very, very serious. So it was almost kind of like one of those things that when there's one problem, you start getting a million other problems. So bad enough we had depression, but then we have this devastating drought in the middle part of the country. And the Dust Bowl lasted for years. And what many farmers began doing is they just said, there's no way I can make a living here. So they began loading up everything they owned onto some busted up old car to try to go out to California or some other area in the West to try to make a different life for themselves, picking fruit, working in a factory or whatever, just because it just was not working anymore. Actually, living in these Dust Bowl hit areas. Now, when these people were called the Okies. Now we talked a little about that migrant mother, that picture of that lady who looks so much older than she actually is with the 3 babies. She's an Okie. So those are these. They were Arkies too. Because some people came from Arkansas to go out west, just because why not, right? The Dust Bowl made it impossible to make a living, so let's just try our luck out in California. The Grapes of Wrath, the book by John Steinbeck, actually tells the story of the Okies. Now, not all New Dealers were on the same page in terms of policy. There were differences of opinion between New Dealers. Now, liberals wanted a much more activist federal government. There were a lot of people who were really on the left who actually worked for the federal government during the New Deal years and wanted FDR to go even bolder, to have the government spend even more money, to have the government put more people to work, give more people financial relief, welfare, and all that. So some people were actually thinking that not only in the Roosevelt administration, but a lot of liberals out in the country felt that even though they loved FDR, but a lot felt that the New Deal was too timid, that it actually should be a lot bolder. Now, there were some conservative instincts that FDR had, believe it or not. For one is that he was committed to a balanced budget, at least in theory, which, considering the economic emergency, it just seemed a little quaint to actually still be worried about a balanced budget, even though he wasn't too worried because we always ran deficits throughout the Roosevelt years. Roosevelt actually was skeptical of the idea of the federal government providing direct relief to people. He actually wanted a lot of the money to be distributed through the states. He feared a permanent underclass of welfare recipients, that there'd be people who just live off the government and never try to find work or anything. So then we'll just have a bunch of lazy moochers. That usually sounds like an argument conservatives make, but that was actually a concern that FDR had, especially in the early parts of the New Deal. There are also turf wars between different agencies. Like some alphabet agencies were like, well, that's my area, and then other ones, no, that's my area. But that always happens, when you're creating these large bureaucracies, right? There are different ones kind of want to state control over a certain area. There was also a debate over make work jobs. A lot of people actually said that these jobs that the New Deal creating, are they actually jobs, or are they just like creations of the government just so they can put people to work? But no, they were jobs. They were real jobs. These workers, ultimately, these New Deal workers who worked in for these, the Public Works Administration was another aid to CCC, which we talked about. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, was a jobs program that was actually established to put unemployed people to work, rebuilding America's infrastructure, dams, public buildings, airports, highways, sewage treatment plants, all the things you need to have a modern society, New Deal workers built. So not only you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone, right? You're putting a lot of people to work, but at the same time, you're rebuilding America. So in that sense, I think that was an enormous success, but conservatives sometimes just don't like, well, not sometimes, never really like the idea of the government actually being an employer. Actually, I don't mean people working for the government, making the government run, but the idea of public works, that the government should be giving people jobs. Conservatives just tend to be skeptical of that. So the New Deal was, even though generally very popular in the country, most Americans were like, oh, finally there's a president who's trying to do something to help. But there was opposition, and a decent amount of opposition to the New Deal. Some liberals, as we said, opposed the New Deal because they felt it should have gone further. Many conservatives, in fact, most conservatives, adamantly oppose the New Deal and everything that Roosevelt stood for, right? Conservatives generally believe in limited government, right? They don't want the government intervening in people's business. And the government was very, very involved in the economy now. So the thing is that that this actually engendered a lot of opposition, even hatred among a lot of people on the right wing of America. There was always, it wasn't really a joke, but like a lot of conservatives refused to even call Roosevelt by name. They called him that man. And if you were a conservative, especially if you were a wealthier conservative, everyone knew you were talking about when you said that man, because you wouldn't even say the name Roosevelt. Such was their hatred toward him. So the majority of people loved FDR and really loved FDR. But there was a sizable amount of people out there who really did not like FDR and didn't like, his policies, did not like the government getting so big. One argument that was used by opponents of the New Deal is, was the New Deal actually helping? Because some people said, well, the Depression is still going on, so like obviously the New Deal isn't working. But that's misleading to argue that. I think unemployment was going down quite drastically. Unemployment was 25%. In 1933 when Roosevelt came in, it was less than 13% by 1936. National income increased in 25% in 1 year. But unemployment was never disappearing. There were a lot of people who were still out of work. The economy was still not strong. So some people made the argument that, well, then what's the point of the New Deal? Now, different sides ideologically had different answers to that. Like more leftist people said, well, that's because the New Deal isn't doing enough. The New Deal should be pumping more money into the economy, putting more people to work. Then that would help even more. While conservatives said, well, the fact that we still have a depression is proof that government spending and big government in general really doesn't help if there's an economic emergency. Now, conservatives despised the New Deal, despised it. And they felt it was just the epitome of government run amok, creeping socialism. That was the term that was common among right wingers in the 1930s and 1940s to describe liberal policies. They called it creeping socialism. Even though, again, the New Deal, we mentioned this in class, but the New Deal was not socialistic or certainly Marxist in any way. It was capitalist. It tried to reform capitalism of its own excesses. It tried to save capitalism. So the whole argument that it's socialist is really unfounded. And in many ways, it's more of a scare tactic than anything, because people hear socialist and they get really scared. Now, in 1934, a group called the Liberty League was founded. It was formed by rich businessmen and conservatives to oppose Franklin Roosevelt and oppose the New Deal policy. So some of the biggest industrialists in America were members of the Liberty League, like some real conservative people. Even Al Smith, who had been the governor of New York, the Democratic nominee for president in 1928, a big liberal governor, but largely because of personal spite toward Roosevelt, because he felt Roosevelt took the nomination away from him in 1932, which we talked about, became an adamant opponent of the New Deal. And I always think this is shameful, because Al Smith did some great things, and Roosevelt was continuing a lot of Al Smith's policies on the national level, and then Al Smith, because of personal spite mostly, began turning against Roosevelt and the New Deal. That's just not right. Now, rich conservatives, in addition to that man, they had another term for FDR. They called him a traitor to his class. They were like, "You're a rich man." And he was really rich, and like old money. And a lot of rich people in America, said like, "You're rich. Like, why do you have the policies that you do, which just, I don't want to say hurt rich people because that sounds weird, but that just tax and regulate rich people so much, that he should be more understanding being a rich person himself." Now, for conservative opponents, FDR was basically the personification of government gone crazy. And Roosevelt had to be stopped, to a lot of the Liberty League types and conservative Republicans. Nevertheless, FDR's hold on the American people was growing. He gave radio addresses, often once a week, called the fireside chats. And I'll play one for you, actually, when next time we have live class, where Roosevelt, just used to go on the radio and explain his policies to the people in very easy to understand language. And he always started all of his fireside chats with "my friends." and then went on to give his speech. His distinctive voice was actually, heard by tens of millions of Americans, for years. The reason it's called the fireside chat is often people kept their radios by their fireplace, back in the day. So these fireside chats really made people feel even more connected to Roosevelt. They stoked patriotic fervor. They were very optimistic in tone. Excuse me, trying to convince people that, we will get through this, but it wasn't just blind optimism, is we will get through this because I'm doing A, B, and C. So that was enormously powerful. And his mastering of the radio was kind of a foreshadowing of politicians in later decades, kind of dominating the medium of TV, right? Especially presidents like Kennedy and Reagan, who really became very popular. And kind of had a real hold on the American people because of their mastery of the media, which was then TV. But Roosevelt has similar impact through radio. Interestingly, FDR, when he saw the first television at the World's Fair in 1939, said, "Oh, that will never catch on." So one thing FDR was wrong about. One thing. No, there were a bunch. Now, in the 1934 midterm elections, remember every 2 years is elections for Congress, the Democrats won 2/3 control of both the House and the Senate. In fact, at the end of the election, there were only 89 Republicans in the House out of 431. So the Democrats had overwhelming majorities. So this was as strong of an endorsement of the New Deal as you can imagine. And Roosevelt took this election and had getting these massive majorities in Congress as a signal that he should go even bolder and focus on that third R, reform. Really try to remake the American economy, make it fairer for everybody, and also make sure that there's never a depression again. All right, guys, so that's what we'll talk about in our video tomorrow. So thank you for watching. Remember, watch these videos from start to finish, and I'll see you again on video tomorrow. Peace.